Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming in this sort of gloomy weather. And it gives me tremendous pleasure to introduce Professor Dale Tomich. By the way, my name is Michaeline Critchlow. Professor Tomich is a mentor, friend, and interlocutor, a leader or the leader in the field of plantation studies. Professor Tomich is an historical sociologist, a theorist, has written and lectured extensively on plantations and slavery in the Americas, especially Cuba, Brazil, Martinique, as well as the US South. His classic text on slavery in the award-winning text on slavery in the circuit of sugar, Martinique and the world economy, 1838 to 1848, was published in 1990 and has recently, 2016, been reissued with a new introduction, and it's as relevant today as it was then. The book is key to understanding the history of Martinique, the link between these wider historical processes and their local reverberations. It pays strict attention to the evolution of capital accumulation at certain historical moments and the responses of the French to these transformations as France sought to preserve its position within the evolving world economy. As well, it focuses on the actions and perhaps motivations of the enslaved in themselves in this mix. Professor Tomich offers vital methodological framework that speaks to the imbrication of the local within the global. The actions of the enslaved, the movements of the French, also how these dynamize and transform the world economy. There's a multi-directional movement in the text arguments and the evidence that it marshals. Martinique's economy becomes a site for understanding grounded developments there, but also developments at the scale of the world economy. As one reviewer stated, the text indubitably demonstrates the capitalist character of slavery and the slave character of capitalism. One is treated as well to a full apprehension of the plot, those provision grounds created by the enslaved and which have now become a sort of signifier in much of the post-colonial cultural studies, even certain philosophical exegeses. They've become a signifier of slave resistance and treated more often than not as simply oppositional to the plantation. If I may say so myself, Professor Tomich offers a more complex view of the origin and role of such plots beyond those offered within these studies. I believe, and though I may be chronologically wrong here, but this way of thinking history has forged a complex historical framework on slavery and plantations addressed through his very productive concept of the second slavery. With this notion of second slavery, a concept now embraced widely by historians of slavery, this adds further depth and clarity toward understanding capital accumulation in the world economy and the role of plantations. The concept facilitates greater clarity to the organization of slavery and commodity production in the 19th century, demonstrating how slavery and capitalism were mutually imbricated as capitalism produced slavery and slavery produced capitalism. This idea of second slavery has certainly taken off. There are conferences and books that incorporated this perspective as scholars track the shifting career of capital and commodity production in the world economy. There are, of course, Professor Tomich's own books and edited volumes too, past and those forthcoming. For example, he published Through the Prism of Slavery and edited The Politics of Second Slavery. His work is appreciated nationally and globally. He has taught at universities here in the United States, namely Berkeley, UC, Princeton, and has also taught in Brazil, in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, at several universities in France. His recent award-winning book, and I have it here, Reconstructing the Landscapes of Slavery, a Visual History of the Plantation in 19th-Century Atlantic World, takes a kind of ecological and visual turn, written in collaboration with a geographer and art historian. The text focuses on plantations in the US South, Cuba, and Brazil and asks us to think about how landscapes are altered, facilitate, and restrict the constructions of projects of accumulation. In this instance, how landscapes in these various locations were implicated variously in the production of sugar, coffee, and cotton. In this text, it's the images that drive, interspersed throughout the text, that drive the narrative in a way, as one reviewer said, that allows for a different and fresh perspective on slavery and capital. A landscape that captures both the topography and the human activity that takes place there. A landscape, if you will, reconfigured in domination, put to work in the interests of profit and domination. All of this, I dare say, the attention to the world economy, both in its macro and micro frame, even personal workings, the critical look at the working of capital and its impact on the planet through a world economy perspective, the way that plantations and slaves changed over time, have tremendous implications for our understanding of the climate crisis, race, and projects of decolonization, the concerns of our lab. Professor Tomich's innovative and historically and methodologically rich opus offers us a different way to think through the knottiness of the literature on the environment, climate crisis, global warming, and global Blackness. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dale Tomich.
That's bandit. Thank you, Mikey, for that generous and eloquent introduction. I'm going to go home and read my own books now. They sound good. Thank you very much for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to come once again back to Duke and back to the John Hope Franklin Center. Mikey's asked me to talk about the plantation environment and race, and the conference is framed in terms of let me just get the right buttons here. Okay, there we go. Plantationocene. And I spent the last month reading about the Plantationocene, and I found it frankly a problematic concept. It's very broad, abstract, and descriptive. It seems like a box into which you put things. And then once you put them there, there's no real way to engage how they relate to one another or what they have to do. And it seems to me there's the environmentalists have gone through 3 steps. One, I guess 4, but I can't pronounce the 4th one, but it doesn't matter. But starting with the Anthropocene, then the Capitalocene, and then the Plantationocene. And so you can add the boxes together or combine them or do various things, but to me, they lack a kind of analytical weight. So I want to present a kind of other way we might think about that today, a way that is centered on the plantation itself and the production of commodities. And I'll focus on slavery, but also talk a bit about after slavery. And what I want to do for the whole presentation here, right now, I'd like to talk about the sugar plantation beginning in the 16th century in Brazil, then in the 18th century in the Caribbean, and then in the 19th century in Cuba, and then just a brief mention of the sugar plantation in Cuba and Louisiana after emancipation, to give you an idea of how they relate to landscape, and then we can talk about how they relate to race and labor. And then in the afternoon, I have some other materials that I don't particularly want to formally present, but we can discuss that have to do with cotton in the South and coffee in Brazil. So when we think then about labor, slave labor, the plantation, and nature, I find it a little bit funny because the plantation's always been a kind of residual category that few people have paid very much attention to. When I first got my position at Binghamton before Mikey got there as a student, I had wanted to teach a course on slavery in the sociology department, but the historians wouldn't let me. So I taught a course on the plantation because no one would think of teaching a course on that. So, but I think the plantation is quite important. But the problem, we always think about it as it. There's a thing called the plantation, and we think we know what it is. And one of the problems of the plantation scene is it is so embracing in its content that it loses its reference. And this was actually evident in some of the earlier studies of the plantation school in Jamaica, where tourism was described in terms of the plantation. Everything the plantation became a metaphor and lost its specific social and historical content. So I want to think, Mikey gave me I wasn't going to particularly say it, but I think it'll help you. My framing is an idea of a capitalist world economy. It comes from Emanuel Wallerstein and the school at Binghamton, but my approach is in a lot of ways very different than his. And what I want to think about is how things are related. To juxtapose the Capitalocene and the Plantationocene, if you think about it, doesn't make very much sense because the plantation is a product of capital and it doesn't exist without its relation to capital. So to think of it as an autonomous thing, generating change, relations to producing race in changing environments, it's only comprehensible if we see how it's part of a broader capitalist system. And from that point of view, the world economy is a useful place to start. I also think in terms of how we think about things, we have to always think about the assumptions we make at the beginning and what we know at the end. So if we say the plantation system and the systems in the America or the world economy, that helps us frame the question, but we then have to say, we don't know what that means until we do some real research and examine what the processes that form these over time and space are. So our concrete knowledge is always the result of our work, not the a priori assumption, and it's not a matter of fitting things into a model, it's developing and deepening our understanding of relations. So one of the readings I sent to you was Charles Wagley's 1957 essay on Plantation America. I find it very useful. It's not a particularly brilliant article, but it's useful because he's an anthropologist writing at a time when people are trying to classify kinds of societies and develop an idea of area studies in cultural regions. And so the difference I see is if the Plantationocene literature takes the plantation as given and then tries to fit things in there, and the justification is, well, what's left out is race, slavery, black labor, colonization out of the Capitalocene, if it's seen just as a Eurocentric thing. So so that's the justification, but there's not really an analysis that underlies it. Wagley is coming at it from a different point of view, where he takes 3 or 4 different variables and he's trying to say, okay, if we look at the Americas, we can see 3 different cultural areas that are defined by environment, by demography, and the nature of different European impacts at colonization, et cetera, et cetera. And out of that, he constructs, we can agree or disagree, it doesn't really matter. But he's trying to explain what makes the plantation a distinctive zone. And then he gives some distinctive attributes of it. So there's always some kind of connection. In lots of ways, he hits some key things, and he does some things that are still innovative. Think about in the idea of global blackness, he's saying, look at slavery as across the Americas and not national slavery first. That's still something we need to learn how to do and pay attention to. So it's not that there's things of value in it, but it's a pretty static, descriptive essay. But what I find interesting, if you, okay, now let's look at plantation. He gives us a geographic zone tied to distinctive environments. And then, and these, so roughly if we go from Sao Paulo to Maryland, along the coastal lowlands of the Americas and the islands of the Caribbean, that's the location of Plantation America. It's not the whole Americas. It's not a world encompassed. There are plantations in Asia, elsewhere we could incorporate as we think, but plantation, seen by itself as an encompassing characteristic, falls short, I think. So what I want to do is sort of trace this through time and look at how the plantation develops its relation to environment and labor, and it's just give you some ideas of how we might go about thinking about it. So here is the map of what's his name? Wagley. Here, okay, here. Where is Sao Paulo? Down here, somewhere south of Rio de Janeiro. Okay, so if you start thinking, okay, plantation, monoculture. Well, monoculture, general term. Let's start looking at specific crops. And when and where. So if you start historicizing that Wagley that way, you start to see a lot more. You see a pattern of how the plantation and enslavement fit into the patterns of the development of world capitalism. So I'm skipping this, but in fact, with my pointer, it died. Of course. Yeah, okay, what else would happen? Okay, so the sugar comes out of Asia, across the Mediterranean, and into the Atlantic with Portuguese and Spanish conquest. And the decisive place, I would argue, and I jump from my camera and just point here, Sao Tome. Sao Tome is the first place where we have sugar monoculture worked exclusively by slave laborers, and all the slaves are Africans. There's also another connection, and Sao Tome is very little studied, and some good things are starting to come out now, but it really is an important place. It's also important because if you look where it is on the map, it's equidistant to the West African regions of the slave trade, and also the Central African regions, Angola, Congo. So the Sao Tomeans were trading in slaves in both places and built up this plantation economy and became slave traders on a large scale. So the point I want to emphasize here is we historians usually break up the plantation from the slave trade as two different monographic subjects, and if we can begin to bring them together as a connected, we see a lot more. There's a wonderful book by Luis Felipe de Alencastro called The Trade in the Living, and it's been published in English by the SUNY University Press. It's a great book, but he says, look, Angola is part of the history of Brazil. And if you want to understand Brazil, it's a double frontier. The expansion of commodity production in Brazil and the expansion of the slave trade in Africa. And they're connected. The interesting point about that, so he's writing about the 16th century. In the 19th century, there's a project for Brazilian independence, and the Angolans join. They want to be independent too. Why is that interesting? Because Britain had abolished the slave trade below some parallel of latitude. If Angola and Brazil both became independent and the same country, it was an internal slave trade, or would be an internal, not an international slave trade, and Britain would have no intervention or justification for intervening. So if we study that in detail, you can see both Britain and Portugal, which at that point was a client of Britain, did everything they could to break up that possibility. So São Tomé is really important, but then the first big jump in sugar production was the jump from São Tomé to Brazil, and the main centers were in Pernambuco and in Bahia. Okay, so the same model of plantation that existed in São Tomé was taken and then produced on a much larger scale in Brazil. And the point here is that the greater output of Brazil transformed European sugar market. It dwarfed the Mediterranean and African Atlantic producers. And suddenly we get a new kind of consumption where the coffee house, the middle class begins consuming sugar, and sugar becomes an important commodity. So I want to start in Brazil. And let me also say, in response to Mikey, São Tomé is where the practice of giving slaves free days to work in their own provision grounds and land to do it began. And it was taken, so you can see that system actually migrating with sugar production. The same system is instituted in Brazil, and in the 18th century, it's taken to the Caribbean by the Dutch, where it's called the system of Brazil. And it's integrated into, the point about the garden is it's part of the plantation and it's not. It fascinates me, it always serves the master's interest. Less cost of producing food, creating loyalty of the slaves to the land so they won't run away, letting them have a family, so that they have a stake. However low their status and how difficult their situation, it ties them to place. But for the slaves, it's a place where they produce their own food, they organize their own activity. I would argue that it's also part of the formation of family and kinship. They organize their own property systems, they become petty marketers, they accumulate some property. So it's a really interesting place. It doesn't have a single outcome, but it's always a place where you see negotiation, conflict, and sometimes even resistance. Okay, so that's moving too. So what do I want to do? Okay, so let's see, plantation. It's going to change as we go through here. And what I would look at is not capital, or just look at the commodity. Plantations are different in terms of what's the crop that's produced, when it's produced, how is it produced. Slavery shifts with that. The book, the landscape book, tries to show the organization of slave life and labor is very different on a coffee plantation than it is on a sugar plantation, than it is on a cotton plantation. And since we're in Carolina, then a tobacco plantation. Those are all different. If we say slavery, 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 we're missing the opportunities that people had to struggle to organize their own lives, what they wanted. I mean, one of the things I think is fundamental, is really hard to do, and we need to try harder, is what did enslaved people think their freedom was? What were they struggling? How did they define their own? Not what do we think they're doing? That's hard to get at. And it might be something as simple as, if I can get my kid to be a carpenter, life is better. How does that work? So you got to get into really a kind of detailed anthropology of communities more, and link it to the bigger kinds of issues. So if you look at the commodity, I think that's really a kind of key. The commodity, on the one hand, links us to nature. Different crops only grow in certain environments. And there's a wonderful, I think I have it for this afternoon. Baton Rouge, Louisiana. You can't grow sugar north of Baton Rouge, because Baton Rouge is at the frost line. You can grow sugar south of Baton Rouge. That's where the American sugar empire was. Coffee only grows in certain places, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where we start. It's looking, how does nature get valorized to produce certain kinds of products? Where and when, by whom, under what conditions? Brings us to sugar. You probably all know Sidney Mintz's wonderful Sweetness and Power. Sugar is this amazing commodity that I think you can trace, you can use it to trace the whole evolution of capitalism, because this human desire for sweet is so powerful, and it takes so many different forms that sugar becomes a kind of battering ram to enter into consumption. People want sugar. The more you can produce, the more you can sell. The cheaper it is, the more people can buy it. So that's important. And it's the link to the plantation zone and urbanization in the European North American metropolis. It also is a cheap source of calories. So if you think of a working class, on the one hand, you think of the middle class, sugar was first a kind of luxury good that was used as a medicine. It was sculpted into fantastic shapes for banquets for rich merchants and aristocrats. Then the middle class started consuming it together with, and it took a big jump when chocolate and coffee came into European consumption. The coffee house emerged, and then it became an item of mass consumption. And one of the interesting things, if you look at England and capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, everybody in England consumed sugar in some form, even the poorest people. So sugar was substituting and providing cheap calories for whatever it was people had been eating before. And therefore, wages went down, et cetera, et cetera. In France, that wasn't the case. My own hypothesis is that the French pastries we love, a lot of those were proclaimed by Colbert. State policies, we're going to have pastry, and they'll be officially certified pastries. We got to find a way, because France, in fact, had the most productive sugar plantations by the 18th century. We got to find a way to get French people to consume pastries. And there's a scene in the Stendhal's Red and the Black where the peasants storm the manor house in the French countryside. And one guy runs straight to the kitchen, finds the sugar bowl, and sticks his head in it and eats everything, because peasants don't have sugar. The opposite. I think most French sugar was re-exported, and that was most of French foreign trade. And it was equal to the foreign trade of England. So we think England had big foreign trade. France, no. France had a big foreign trade, but it was all the re-export of colonial products, which is why, from an economic point of view, the Haitian Revolution was so important. It was the biggest sugar producer and coffee producer in the world, and the biggest source of French exports, and overnight it was gone. And that has big consequences throughout the world economy. So sugar is this interesting thing to look at. The other thing I need to say, sugar, unlike cotton or coffee, is an industrial product because of the nature of processing sugar itself. You grow sugar, sugar has to be cut when it's ripe and ground within 18 to 36 hours. So it has to be cut, it has to be ground, and then it has to be boiled into sugar. If you wait too long, you don't wind up with anything. So there's already an industrial time discipline and a division of labor, and slaves in sugar plantations are organized in an industrial way from the beginning in São Tomé. Now, what I will try to show you is that changes, or it gets more and more refined and sophisticated in terms of how you get more labor out of the slaves. But unlike the other crops, sugar it has this industrial work discipline, and it requires mechanical processing, the grinding and the boiling. Okay, so it's interesting on the point of how it's produced and how it's consumed. Okay, so we look at sugar, and then the demand for labor. Let's think of coffee, cotton, sugar. Each one is different. Each has a different labor requirement. And if you think about this over time, it means the number of slaves on a plantation and what their jobs are is going to vary with the kind of crop they're producing. I'll show you at the end a Cuban sugar plantation with 500 enslaved workers in a completely mechanized process. In Mississippi, in Natchez, the big demand for labor in cotton was at the harvest. So you had to have enough slaves to harvest the cotton. Then you had to find something for people to do the rest of the year, because idle hands are the devil's work, right? When a plantation got to 100 people, they'd start a new plantation because it wasn't practical to have more than that on one property. So cotton's the U.S. is the main source of the cotton for the Industrial Revolution, but the units themselves seldom went over 100 people. Okay, but they multiplied the number of plantations. So the Natchez planters, which we can talk about this afternoon, were the richest planters in the America. The story of Natchez is that there are more millionaires between Natchez and New Orleans than anywhere else in the United States before the Civil War. There are also more enslaved people there than anywhere else before. So put two and two together, capitalism and slavery here. So they're tremendously rich, but they own 5, 10, 20 plantations. It can go from Arkansas to Texas, and there's even a couple sugar plantations in Cuba that they own. They're fantastically rich with a lot of properties, different than Cuba or Brazil, which planters can have several properties there, but this multiplication is really characteristic of the antebellum cotton South in the lower Mississippi Valley. So, okay. Then we have to look, the last thing so I've got the crop creates a demand for the labor. My way of thinking about it, you may not jump on right away. My argument is there's no economy within the plantation because there's no price of labor. Enslaved people are owned. You control labor by controlling people. There's no other way to get it. So if you work for wages, you sell your labor as a commodity with a price. And you can say, what's the price? How much you produce per hour? You can't do that with enslaved people because there is no relation of labor. It's paradoxical because they're working all the time. That's why they're there. But it's not a social relation. It's through the domination of human beings. So my argument is paternalism is not about whether you treat your slaves well or not. It's whatever you do, you have to deal directly with human beings. And that's the only way you can get them to work. You can whip them, you can give them rewards, you can do whatever you're going to do, but you're always dealing with concrete individuals. And if you want to economize the plantation, there's no way to do it. You can't economize labor because labor is not a category you can put your hands on. It doesn't have a price. The people have a price. Okay, so what that means is that slavery expands production. You can squeeze more out of the people you have. I'm not saying that's not possible. But what I'm saying, if you really want to expand production systematically, the only way to do it is to put more slaves on more land. Okay, if you invent a new machine, let's say to refine sugar, you might get more and better sugar, but you don't save labor. And in because you have you have the same enslaved people there, and you got to figure out what you're going to do with them because you just took their jobs away. And you can't just shift from one sector to another like magic. It's hard. So technology is not labor saving. I don't know, there's a debate going around on the cotton that my friend Ed Rice, Ed Baptist, is saying, slaves were beaten to increase their output. We know the output went way, way up for slave. They picked much, much more cotton. There was also new breeds of cotton that were easier to pick. So some economist does a regression analysis. It wasn't violence, it was a new breed of cotton. But somebody had to pick it. And they picked it in greater and greater numbers, and you can read Solomon Northrop to understand what the cotton picking, what it was like to pick cotton in Louisiana and Mississippi in the 19th century. It's a wonderful description. So labor is not a category, so a social category. You can't touch it. You can talk about sugar or cotton or coffee. You can talk about the price of slaves. But the price of slaves has nothing to do with the work the slave does. And if you own slaves, you have to feed them and clothe them, or your investment is going to go kaput, whether they work or not. So you got to make, so the rationale behind the repressiveness of the plantation, of the slave plantation, is you have to get these people to work in a productive way through some kind of mechanism to discipline their activity, because the way, the wage doesn't, they have no interest in producing. The fact wage workers have little either, but that's a different discussion we can have. So that's where I'm coming from on that score. Okay, so let us begin our journey. So let's go over this quick. So the first, where's my Eric? I'm going to jump away from the camera people because I have to point. Brazil, 16th and 17th century. French and British Caribbean in the 18th century. And then Cuba, I'll talk about in the 19th century. But if you look at this, you can also see after sugar came gold in Brazil, and then with the Cuban sugar came, and in the 18th century, we can also see rice and tobacco in the U.S. And then in the 19th century, it was coffee in Brazil, sugar in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and cotton in the U.S. South. We can see these as part of the pattern of capitalist expansion. The Brazilian sugar plantations of the 19th century, 18th century, 17th century, 16th and 17th century, formed the capitalist world market. And if you're into Marx at all the Marxists miss entirely what Marx says in Capital, that the history of capital begins in the 16th century with the formation of the world market. It doesn't begin with the Industrial Revolution in England. If you shift it to the 16th century, then you have to think about slavery, because there was no wage labor industry in Europe. There were wage laborers, but they didn't control everything. You have all kinds of peasants, slaves, serfs, whose product is going to form a world market centered on Antwerp and Amsterdam through the activities of merchants tied to urbanization, the formation of new groups of producers and consumers, and industries tied to colonial expansion, shipping, sugar refining, et cetera, weaving. So we're starting at the beginning of capital, and the Brazilian sugar becomes, after gold or silver in Spanish America, sugar becomes the most important commodity in world production. It's something that had been a European trade with India and Asia, now is internalized and produced within the European economy. And they need labor. And Africa becomes the source of labor. The interesting thing, so Mikey and I were talking about this last night. Africans become the source of labor. There had been slavery in Europe before. It was primarily Christians enslaving Muslims and Muslims enslaving Christians, and it was a kind of multiracial slavery. But religion was the defining event. And then I have most of my life worked on 19th century slavery. And now I want to go back for the reasons Mikey's suggesting, is we have to understand the origins of all of this. And that's what I can contribute to. I can't do today's eco crisis. But if you go back to the beginning, Africans, the Portuguese go and they tap into and divert and expand an existing African slave trade. But now, Sao Tome being the case, slaves become exclusively African, and it needs some kind of legitimation. And the kind of political intellectuals of the Portuguese Empire were the Jesuits. And the last time, some of you were here the last time I came, what fascinates me is the justifications of African slavery were religious. Because Africans did not know God, did not know Jesus. And who I talked about last time, Antonio Vieira, invented a whole eschatological justification of racial slavery. That Africans, it's based on this kind of prophetic thinking. He was later arrested by the Inquisition, and the church closed down prophecy. But his idea was Africans were at the foot of the cross with Mary. And they were transformed in this mystical moment of the crucifixion into the special children of Mary. And their duty was, they had to atone, I forget the sin element of this, but they had to atone for their sin by serving Mary, which was to work and to pray the rosary. And if you go to Brazil, any place there's a large black population, you see a church, Our Lady of the Rosary. This idea, this special connection to Mary and the Rosary still exists. And it's an institution that's used in many interesting ways by the Afro-Brazilian population. Vieira that was a kind of one-shot deal. But his successor Jesuits defined the plantation order as an ethical order. You have to remember, in the 16th century, economics and economic thinking didn't exist. They fused Aristotle and Christianity, and they came up with the ethical duties of reciprocal ethical obligations of master and servant. Slaves weren't seen as laborers, they were seen as servants of the master, and the master was this paternalistic authority over the whole plantation complex. And that's where the idea of the children of Ham came from. They got rid of the eschatological thing. Ham, the descendants of Ham have this collective sin to atone for, and enslavement is their path to salvation. Okay, so this is completely religious. It happens to be black people who this is applied to, African people, but the way it's understood is in the religious ways that the Portuguese understood and justified everything. So part of what we've been talking about is how this changed. In the 18th century, this religious view is gone. And the Enlightenment comes in and rethinks what is race, what is all this, how do we understand it? And let me not go, save it for later. I'm going to wander off if I go. Okay, so we have this kind of interesting social economic complex, environmental complex. And now I'm way behind where I ought to be. Okay, so not all of Brazil is a sugar plantation. There are just very few small parts. Can I go back? Did I miss one? Here. Oops, there we go. Here. This is not, I wanted a better map. The sugar zones are enclaves along the coast. And the only ones that are really very productive are the ones up centered on Olinda and Recife in the upper part, and Salvador in the middle. Okay? Those are the big centers of 16th, 17th century Brazilian sugar production. Now what did I do? Turn the whole thing off. Oh, I pushed it off. Okay. Here. No, I want the map. There we go. Okay. So if we look, this is the sugar zone. And what we want to see is, first of all, there's lots of rivers. Okay, that means transportation. It also means power, to power the sugar mills. And Salvador is a splendid port that connects up with overseas. So, and the soil is called Massapé soil. It's very rich fertile soil. It doesn't get exhausted. You can keep planting and planting and planting and planting on it. So it's a great place for sugar. And the sugar plantations go there. And I can't even push a button here. Here we go. Okay. So the dominant kind of sugar mill is a water mill. So look, I'm going to show you all this technology, and it's important. But it's an indicator of how the whole plantation complex is changing, okay? And how we can, and its relation to nature. Okay, so the first mill is this horizontal mill with two rollers powered by water. So the big planters controlled access to those rivers and could build mills that gave them power and a way to ship the product to the port, okay? And the Brazilian sugar slave owners are called the masters of the sugar mill. And they're virtually like aristocrats. People are dependent upon them. It's their status that controls everything. You can read Gilberto Freire, all these Brazilian writers at that time. Okay, and it's the model of the sugar mill is Aristotle's model of the oikos, or the household, that has a paternal authority that controls the whole thing. It's not it's not a model of commercial production. And that's the problem with the Jesuits. They can't abandon Aristotle because it's tied to their idea of salvation, and following Aristotle plus Christian theology equals the road to salvation, and what counts is the end of time. And secular history is subordinated to that. So they can't step out of the Aristotelian model and the model of moral authority to see this as an economic enterprise run for a profit. The balance is, they got to fit one within in the other, and it doesn't work. But they show us how the relations of domination work inside the sugar mill, which is kind of okay. So we have this mill. They control their own land, plant sugar, have slaves that are adequate to supply the sugar and run the mill. And there are, I think in Bahia, there's 120 mills like this, and that transforms the sugar market. But they also have dependents who are free people and slave owners who are obligated to grind their sugar in the mill. So the cane production is dispersed among different social groups, and enslaved people are the property of these two different groups. And there's relations of dependence based on the mill between them. So there's more output, they can get the maximum use out of the mill, but there's also really complicated relations between the owner of the mill and the cane farmers, because you need your cane ground at the right time, and that's a big power struggle. Okay, so let's see, let's go on. Okay, so why am I jumping? Am I pressing too hard? Okay, so this is the mill. And then what I wanted to show you here, I've got a trigger finger on this clicker. No, I want to go, no, yes, okay, this works. So once the cane is ground, so you got to think everything, all the fields have to be timed to bring the cane to the mill when it's at the maximum moment. Then it's ground. In the square thing, they're trying to remove, there's like 7% impurities in the cane juice that you have to get out, or it doesn't, it's worse. But then the cane is boiled down in a succession of iron cauldrons. As it thickens, it's transferred from one cauldron to the next, until it gets so thick and it's ready to crystallize into sugar. Then it's cooled off. I'll show you that in a second. What I want you to see here is that each cauldron has its own fire. So the sugar mill is like tremendously wasteful of the forest. You had to cut down huge amount of trees to keep boiling sugar for 6 or 8 months out of the year. So you get deforestation, you have this fertile soil, but it's happening in a very specific environmental enclave. Now, all sorts of stuff happens. The Dutch invade Brazil, then they're expelled, and they go to the Caribbean. They think, colonialism's a bad deal. Let's let the British and French do it. We'll give them the technology and the slaves who know how to use it, and we'll give them access to the market in Amsterdam as citizens of Amsterdam. Because everything in the 18th is still kind of corporate rights. Citizens have rights to trade that outsiders don't have, are exempt from taxes and tariffs. So it's a good deal. Where am I here? They go to, I wish this still worked. No, that. Okay, so the small islands of the Caribbean and Jamaica, and then Binghamton. Okay, in the starting around 1640 into the 18th century, that becomes the center of world sugar production. Okay, and now the world market is formed, and it's when Brazil started, the Atlantic was Portuguese. Portuguese controlled the slave trade. They controlled the sugar trade. There was no opposition. Now there's a market and competition in the market through mercantilism. States are trying to colonize islands in the Caribbean, start sugar production through colonial controls in metropolitan, get it back to their internal economy to increase their own capital accumulation. Okay, so it's now a kind of competitive market where there's an explicit demand for sugar that's backed by the power of European states and European colonialism. Now, in Brazil, a new technology had shown up. Oh, sorry, I can do this one. If we look at the pattern, here's Jamaica in the 18th century. In the Caribbean, the plantations are concentrated along the coast. There aren't so many big waterways. It means there's the coastal lowlands, there's access to water transport across the coast, and then in Jamaica there's a river that, there's a valley that sugar is grown in. But it's a different pattern of where the plantations are constructed. Okay, I mean, so that again, a specific part of nature is valorized, a particular environment is exploited. And like I said before, if we look at a Caribbean sugar plantation in the 18th century, you can see the influence of the Enlightenment. Everything is measured and laid out geometrically to maximize the output of land and how you get the sugar to the mill, coordinating the sugar you grow with the mill. And you can see the fields are divided up into regular plots. Each plot has a calculable amount of cane. You can figure out how long it'll take to cut each one. And cane takes 18 months to ripen. And so, but when you start planting it, the stuff you plant first is going to ripen way before the stuff you plant last. So you have to take that into account. You have to calculate everything from the moment you lay out the fields and plant to the moment you harvest to be efficient. And so we see that in the Caribbean. And we see measurement of the fields and measurement of the capacity of the boiling house and the mill. Because you can't have too much sugar and you can't have too little. You have to keep the machinery going constantly. And in the harvest, it went around the clock. The only time they stopped is when they had to clean the machinery. That was Sunday. Not because it was Sunday, but because it was the day they stopped. And here, but then you can see some things are grown as estate crops, manioc, bananas, vegetables. And here you see the slave digging down, slaves living in cabins, overseen, and mill, and stable storage. But everything is laid out symmetrically. Okay. Here. This is the remember I said you could expand production by moving to new land and getting more slaves. And that's also the moment you could have technological innovation, because if you go back to Brazil, new technology didn't say, what was the point of new technology? It's just that you had excess slaves or not enough slaves. It didn't change the production equation. This kind of sugar mill actually developed in Brazil in the 17th century, okay? But and who used it were those cane farmers who wanted to become planters and have their own mill. But it didn't really transform production at all. The Dutch took it from Brazil to the Caribbean. And this became the dominant production or technology in the Caribbean in the 18th and 19th century, because you could power this with oxen or wind power or water power. You didn't have to have those big rivers. And small planters with less capital could afford this kind of mill. It was productive, but it was a shift in technology, okay? And it fit into the Caribbean conditions. So if we, let me see. Why do I keep jumping? Where was I? Hello, yeah. Oh, up, down. I don't want to be there. No. I know I'm running late. Oh, okay. Well, yeah, okay. Maybe I could skip the quote. No. Oh, here. So here's a windmill, and there inside you can see the vertical mill. Okay. Oh, this is Antigua, 1810 or something. And now let's try and see what we get. There's the mill, and here's the boiling house. Okay. In the drawing, we saw the guy with that kind of box. Now we see these big vats where someone is trying to, they put some different kinds of chemicals in to make the impurities precipitate, and then they try to skim them off, which isn't very effective, frankly, because you mix in and skimming, you mix the junk in with the good stuff. But then you see the succession, there are two of them, successions of cauldrons, one going each way, where the sugar is being boiled down into a thicker and thicker mass, and then in these vats, it cools and crystallizes and becomes sugar. Then you have to do some other stuff to get it out. Okay, so this is, and the other big invention was what's called the Jamaica train. Instead of each cauldron having its own fire, they were able to construct one big fire that ran through a flue and up a chimney and heated all the kettles. So it was a huge saver in energy. And secondly, instead of using wood, you could use the dried stalks of the sugarcane. So think of that idea of the biosphere, that carbon is being taken out of the plant, converted into heat, and then dispersed into the. But the other thing is all of this, none of this is on such a scale it's going to change the damn planet, but you can see the processes at work. And it can produce local climate changes. And if you go to the south of Martinique, for example, the cutting down of the trees changed the climate way back in the 18th century. So they can get micro changes, but and you can see the processes at work. But the plantation seen by itself is not some mega process that's creating global disaster. It's mining the soil and the work to make the plantation is also the huge work of clearing the forest, digging ditches, irrigation, before you even plant the cane. And the cane itself is really onerous physical labor. Okay, and we know who did the onerous physical labor. So there's a lot of work here in transformation of the environment, destruction of the forest, soil erosion. I mean, the Caribbean soils are much less fertile than the Brazilian one, which is exceptional. But then we get these new kinds of changes, in part because they were running out of forest. They had to find a new source of fuel. So this met a new standard that let them use the cane stalks. Okay, so now jump to the 19th century. This is, to me, the coolest map I've ever seen about sugar. This is a map of the railway network in Cuba in 1857. The railroad lines, the heavy dark lines, coincide exactly with the expansion of the sugar belt. And the dotted lines is where the railroad is going to go, what new lands are going to open up for sugar. The other thing that's, what we'll see is the sugar mills are built along the railroad track and sugar financed the railroad. This is a whole sugar operation. It's also, you can see, if you look at the map closely, there are steamboats that carry some sugar along the coast, and there's also telegraph lines to Philadelphia and New York. So merchants in Philadelphia and New York can see what the Cuban crop is going to be while it's still growing. And even in the outback of Cuba, planters can know the price of sugar in New York. But what makes this map really, really interesting to me, you get not only the distance between the stations, but the time. So this map transforms all of Cuba into an abstract time-space grid in which everything is calculable. You know, how much sugar is being grown, where it's going to go, how fast it's going to get there, how far it's got to go. You can know everything. What I didn't show you, and the railroads run right into big warehouses in Havana and in Matanzas, the two big sugar ports. The cool thing is in 1857, just after the map was made, the US's foremost iron engineer went and built new warehouses at, I forgot, what's the town across the bay from Havana? Remedios? I don't remember anymore. Anyhow, each plantation has storage for its own sugar. The train pulls right into the warehouse, huge overhead cranes take the sugar, store it, and they can then take it right out into the ships to sail. So it's a continuous flow processing system. Okay, so here, all of the places I'm talking about are what Jason Moore calls commodity frontiers. That is to say, open, sparsely populated spaces that have ideal environmental conditions for a specific crop. Cuba, there was no, except for the region right around Havana, there was no agriculture in Cuba because Spain's forests had been depleted. And Cuba was the center of construction for the Spanish Navy and the Spanish Merchant Marine. So Havana is kind of a hyper city because it's this big center of naval construction. And the Cuban forests were essential to that construction. And because of that, the Department of the Navy controlled the forest, and no agriculture was permitted except local food growing in between the trees. You couldn't cut down it. If you own land, you couldn't cut down trees on your own property. So there couldn't be agriculture. So the land was dispersed in these big circles for essentially wild cattle or wild pigs. But you couldn't cut down the trees, and it was sparsely settled. In 1817, after the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the decline of Spain as a naval power, the sugar planters won out over the maritime interests, and they changed the law of the forest. You could cut down trees. So this map shows the breaking up of these old circular properties for cattle and pig raising into sugar plantations, because the land was way too big to be effective for sugar. And if you look at the map on the other side, you can see the dark line is across and up and down there's the railroad. And then around it, you can see the various sugar plantations. So they're all constructed in proximity to the railroad. And the other thing that's interesting is how the majority population in this district are black slaves. The town is white and free mulattoes who have militias. And in the Spanish mind, they were the armed counterforce to any potential rebellion but the slaves on the plantations. So this was the imaginary of power. But you can see how it's integrated into the railroad and how the space is constructed. And this is the Cuban sugar mill at the height of its development. This place had, I think, 500 enslaved Africans and 100 some Chinese contract laborers, because the slave trade was finally been abolished. If we look at Cuba, what you see is that this enormous space from Havana eastward, where there's no agriculture. It's flat, and it has ideal conditions for sugar cultivation. Spain was also able to preserve the slave trade up until the 1850s. Now, what's interesting, I think, about my idea of the second slavery is we all think slavery was dying in the 19th century, because we look at it through English eyes. But if you look at the slave trade, you can go to the slave trade database online. Between 1820 and 1850, there were more slaves going across the Atlantic than at any other time in the Atlantic slave trade, but they were only going to Cuba and Brazil. So there's unlimited land and unlimited, more or less unlimited labor available. So what happens is each time there's a new, this is also the Industrial Revolution, each time there's a new technological innovation, the steam-powered grinding mill that could grind much more sugar, Cuba could expand into the new frontier and build new and bigger plantations. Then came, so, I jump one? No. We'll go back. Then came these guys. Instead of boiling in an open kettle, boiling in a vacuum at a lower temperature, much more and much higher quality sugar. But A, it's extremely expensive, and B, it consumed an enormous amount of cane. And you had to keep it going constantly. So suddenly we get these industrial giants in Cuba. Let me find my way back here. Yeah. Okay, so this is like the, huge compared to that little drawing I showed before. So each time there's a new invention, it goes further and further into the interior to open up new spaces and build bigger and more technologically advanced plantations with more slaves. And it's the railroad that's taking them there. So a lot of times people compare slavery and serfdom as a kind of forced labor. Serfs were tied to the land. I think what's important about slavery is slaves were mobile. They could be moved. They moved across the Atlantic. They moved from place to place. And in addition to the transatlantic slave trade, I also should add, there were between 1 and 2 million enslaved people who moved from the upper South to Louisiana and Mississippi. If you put all that together, there were more enslaved people being forcibly transported in the middle of the 19th century, when slavery was supposedly ending, than at any other time in the history of Atlantic slavery. So something's wrong with our narrative. We have to rethink, we have to think the whole picture, and we got to pay attention to what these relationships are and reinterpret them. So we had to, so this kind of mill, unlike the cabin, here is the slave quarters, the master's house, and then here's the sugar factory. Now, here, okay. So you had to, bon voyage. The greater quantity of material you had to move, the more precise your calculations had to be. Because you had to continuously supply these big machines with sugarcane to be processed and to go through the whole process continuously. So we see the breakdown of the fields are much more extensive. The labor of cutting, there's still hand labor cutting the cane, and that's much more intensive. And this had to be planned from the beginning on an enormous scale. If you look here, this is the detail of a bigger map. If you can see, each plot is numbered, and it gives you how much cane is grown in each one. So it's a pretty map, but it's a strategic map. It's to plan the whole cycle of sugar production and to calculate everything. And the other thing that's notable is there's so much, you have to move so much material over so much distance, is they begin cutting these roads directly to the mill from the fields, so you don't have to zigzag through these fields. You get on the road, and then the movement of the cane carts is planned. It's not just cutting. So if we look at this picture closely, what we see, if you look, first, the cane is cut into standardized lengths, and the carts themselves are of a standardized size. So the whole calculation of the harvest is done in terms of cartloads. Also notice that all of the women working, all of the workers here are women, most of them, doing the cart and loading and transportation. So this becomes a much more precise, large-scale process. And I don't think all the Cuban planters did this, but there are some manuals that say some planters, instead of assigning the laborers to the plots of cane in the field, assign them to carts. And that every time a cart came, the load had to be ready. Which, if you think about it, is they transformed the whole plantation into a conveyor belt, organized around the constant movement of the carts. And the routes of the carts were planned so they didn't get in each other's way. They circulated around, moving constantly from the fields to the mill and back again. Okay, so we've come a long way from where we were in Brazil. The plantation isn't static. It adapts to different kinds, is adapted to different kinds of environment with different kinds of environmental consequences. Let me see. So here's, you can see the whole process. This is the inside of the same mill. A whole battery of steam engines. You see the big high pressure mill to grind the cane, where in the first models, women would put cane stalks into the rollers, and they could get their arms caught, and they had an axe right there. If you got your arm caught, cut off your arm, otherwise you get killed. It was really dangerous work. It wasn't heavy work, but it was dangerous work. Here, conveyor belts feed big quantities of cane into this huge mill. Then it's pumped up, and this is, remember the skimming I told you about? Now they pump the juice into here, into these barrels. You put the chemicals to precipitate out the impurities, and at the bottom is a faucet. You open the faucet, if the juice is clear, you keep it open, it runs out. When it gets cloudy, you close it. So I always like the great Cuban sugar historian Manuel Moreno Francino. The slaves couldn't work the machinery. I think if I had the choice between cutting cane in the field and keeping up with the cart and opening or closing a faucet all day, I could figure that out. It's not beyond me. And in fact, the slaves could do everything except repair the machinery. And they did everything except. So this whole slavery technology thing is another thing that we re-examine. After that, the cane, it goes to the filters, which gives it one more cleaning, and then it's pumped into these vacuum pans. And these are in a series, so that the heat from the steam from the first one heats the second one heats the third one. And then the water is recycled in these condensers. Then it's spun around here to separate the remaining molasses from the sugar crystals, packed in crates, and away it goes onto the railroad. The whole configuration of life and labor changes. Slave quarters now shift to the barracon, the barracks. A big central compound, a clock to regulate all of the activities on the plantation, and one entrance. So in the morning, the overseer blows his bugle, whatever he's got, and all the slaves come out and assemble right away. They're marched out the door and handed tools that work. So you can't say, in the old days, you could say, oh, my hoe is dull, I got to go get a new one, or you can't do that, or I broke this, and then you're marched off to work. The second story is a hospital, and then the thing in the middle is appallingly interesting. It's a steam kitchen. You could cook food for 500 people in 45 minutes in there. So that puts a dent in both diet and cuisine, I think. And here, the provision grounds people are searching to find them. It's much more a kind of self-sustaining system of reproducing the slaves and reproducing their labor. Okay. Now, just to give you so then after emancipation, the big move is to separate. Remember, I said you couldn't calculate the labor. So the big move is to separate the cultivation of cane from the factory and the construction of big sugar factories with very advanced refining technology. You can see the extensiveness of the fields up at the top. Now you see 4 vacuum pans all hooked together in this idea of the flow of material. Remember the diagonal roads to transport as the fields get more, when you separate them, then you can calculate the amount of sugar, and you can introduce an elemental kind of calculability that wasn't there in slavery when it was all together. And now, in terms of the global blackness trajectory, one of the interesting things is the enslaved people who worked in sugar become proletarians who work on wage workers who work on sugar mills after slavery in Cuba, which isn't the case in Brazil, and it's not the case in the South. So how do we explain these different social trajectories, what they mean for how people struggle and what forms them as social subjects and defines how people culturally construe race? Okay, but these diagonal roads become internal railroads. The fields are so far away that big planters build train lines to carry the cane to the mill because it's too far for animals to carry. If you ever go to Cuba, which some days seems more possible than other days, a place to go is Trinidad on the south coast, which is called the Valley of the Sugar Mills. And it has a lot of historical sugar mills there. And if you go to the museum in the town, there's an interesting map because it shows all the slave sugar mills from the first part of the 19th century. And then after the Spanish-American, after the Americans invaded and American capital came in, they built a big refinery at the port and ran a railroad through all the old sugar mills, and they all simply produced cane for the sugar mill. So the mill became corporate, and all those people who had been planters and aristocrats lost their status. They were simply cane growers for a corporate mill and employing wage laborers. But here you can see the size of the mill and the centrality of the railroad. And so what happens? Cuba brought us sugar, and I think sugar is going to kill Cuba. I mean, it's if you drive from the middle, it's more than a third. From the eastern part of the sugar belt to Havana, it's just one sea of sugarcane. It's all got parasitic plants, and it's awful. And the Cubans say, this is a contemporary socialist sugar mill resurrected in Cuba, lacking all the technology it needs because of the American embargo. And as my dear friend Reinaldo, who wrote that book with me, said, it was the coolest project of my life. We spent 5 years traveling in Cuba, Brazil, and the South. Reinaldo said, oh, how interesting. In Brazil, they keep the big house and tear down the barracons. in Cuba, we keep the barracones and tear down the big house. So if you go here, you still find people living in the housing of at least the post-emancipation sugar mill, and often from the slavery period, which is, as much as I want to be in solidarity with Cuba, I still can't wrap my head around. I went to take pictures, and the guy said, "Watch your head. This is a historic site. Pieces will fall on you." And that's what they live with every day. So that's one outcome. And now here is Louisiana, the south of Baton Rouge sugar belt. This is the, what's his name? Warmouth plantation, Magnolia. And it's huge. Just a few pictures. Whoops. Okay, so you can see the elaborate technology inside. And Warmouth himself commissioned these to kind of promote himself. And then here are the workers' houses, and the workers are again are all black wage workers. But it's a much different scene than the slave barracks, but still, as we say, North company housing of a certain kind. Now the environmental point that in terms of plantation scene is this doesn't exist anymore. It's all oil tanks. I mean, the petroleum industry has come up the Mississippi River with railroad tanks, refining facilities, and has destroyed the historical landscape. If you want, I mean, the big touristy New Orleans plantation house is between two big oil refineries. I mean, it doesn't have the cachet of the Old South. So if we think of the plantation, I mean, this is just one, it changes over time. We can trace the changes by tracing the commodity that it produces and how it's produced and what are the technical and environmental and social conditions that allow it to produce. And I'll say the commodity can also tell us, and we can talk about this after, how plantations are different in different places. So it gives you a much more flexible tool to think about this and to think. So, you know, in Brazil, Bahia still produces sugar, and it's been revitalized by ethanol. On a big, but it's much more concentrated than it used to be. Other places, it's just died. In Haiti, it died for quite good reasons. It was killed, and there's an interesting story to tell about the movement from San Domingue to Cuba, which, if I can find it, there's a really good YouTube movie on. And here, because of the river and the Gulf and the oil, the environment was transformed in a completely different way. So all I'm saying is that the relation of plantation to environment and the relation to labor and to how race is conceptualized is really quite flexible and historical, and as are the consequences. And so I think we need to, so I think thinking about, I mean, for me, using the commodity as the prism to look through this stuff has been very productive, but to think about this as historically changing relations that are simultaneously relations to nature and to labor, especially black labor, and then to how racism is constructed and how people struggle against that, to me opens up a different way of thinking about it that can be more productive. So I probably have gone way over my time. I was going to bring a watch to time myself, but I never look anyhow. I'm sorry for talking too much, but I'll stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor, for this amazing talk. Now, if anybody would like to make some questions, also the crowd in the through Zoom can also post their question in the Q&A session, and I will be reading out loud. So if anybody would like to ask a question.
You have to be on Zoom, I think.
Just for the Zoom crowd.
Okay, better? Okay. I might have missed something, but what happened to the slave plots in
I dropped it. Okay.
Because that was I had no idea that the slave plots were in one place. I sort of thought of them as like kitchen gardens.
That was kind of unusual. I think that was that was the Enlightenment gone wild.
I know, yeah.
So this is the deal with, I mean, usually the provision grounds, there were two kinds of plots. One are house gardens outside your cabin, and then the provision grounds.
Right.
The provision grounds were always on marginal land where you couldn't grow
Okay.
sugar, usually in the Caribbean, up in the beginnings of the hills. And slaves were, I mean, but they were supposed to have Sunday off and they could work
Right.
in a half the Saturday. Whether I don't think they always got it in the what do we call that, harvest season.
Right.
Okay, so it's always contested, and I think what rather than seeing these as kind of isolated beacons of resistance took place there without a doubt. But it also I would think about them as forming a culture in ways I think I think they're related to I mean, you used to think people had to form kinship relations.
Right.
Right. And and they brought knowledge of planting things, how to plant.
Right.
I mean, there's definitely things that people brought with them and were
Right.
free to use and to develop there and to adapt New World plants to New World gardens,
Yep.
along with Old World techniques, etc. So it's a complicated place, and I like them because it's a place where the power of the masters and the enslaved coincide, but they're not the same. But they don't. And when I wrote the book on Martinique, most of my friends were telling me that, oh, you're showing how slaves were co-opted into slavery. And I said, no, I'm showing you how they resisted slavery, because I mean, what I showed in the Martinique book is that in the 1840s, because France was colonial sugar was competing with French beet sugar for the same market.
Right.
And there was a huge pressure on output.
Right.
And at the same time, it was clear because of international politics that slavery wasn't going on to get forever. So the French state from the Code Noir, which is what, the 17th century, had wanted to prohibit slave gardens and make the masters responsible for the maintenance of their slaves. But they couldn't suppress it because the slaves did it. And they kept going. But by the 1840s, the state backed it. They said, oh, we're going to go to emancipation. The way we can keep the labor force there is by protecting their rights to have these provision grounds.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you the end when you finish your question.
The only thing, I mean, this is that though the provision lines just fascinate me. But I was just reading about, well, I decided I was actually going to read the 1833 Act.
Emancipation.
Well, emancipation was 1/3 of it.
Oh, it's 1830.
1/3 of it was apprenticeships,
Mm-hmm.
and 1/3 of it was compensation.
Yeah.
And the actual emancipation is very short. The other stuff is very long, But when the enslaved people were turned into, or were supposedly to become apprentices,
Mm-hmm.
and their master, and basically still their owner, because they could still be sold, was supposed to provision them, but not from things he bought, from things they produced.
Uh-huh.
I think it was specified, which is it's just interesting.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, first of all, the plantations by then are bankrupt.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
But let me finish the Martinique story, because I think it's the one I know best, and I think it's cool.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't generalize it. But what I would say is every place has its own specificity.
Right. Very interesting.
But what happened is the enslaved people asserted more and more. The masters tried to suppress the provision grounds. The slaves asserted their rights over them, and expanded the internal market. I mean, the whole population of Martinique depended upon these provision grounds to survive, because they provided most of the basic food for the whole island. But what happened is once they got control of the provision ground, they started to go on strike in the sugar mill, because they had a base where they could survive independently of the sugar mill. And they said, we're not going to work at night, because the practice has been to work all day in the fields and then go work at night in the mill. And so there's all these strikes. And then and it's wonderful, because I read the governor's report. They send out the gendarme. Oh, there was a strike at this plantation, and nothing big, we put it down. And then that's nothing big, we put it. But then you start looking, the sugar production dropped by 30%. exactly when the competition with the beet sugar was reaching its height. So they not only controlled their subsistence, but I think they created a crisis of labor. And then, and I think is, and I always had even when I rewrote it, the conclusion to that book has always been hard for me to write. The conclusion is actually in the book Through the Prism of Slavery. What happened after emancipation is fascinating.
Right.
Because, and here's, why how did slaves think about their own freedom?
Yeah.
After emancipation, they didn't abandon the plantation.
Right.
Instead, they used the provision grounds so women and children got out of plantation work. And then men formed gangs and went around and bargained for wages on plantations.
Interesting.
And because they needed cash.
Right. Yep.
And the only way they could get cash was to have wages.
Although, if they went, one of the schemes was that slaves, this is earlier, that slaves, when they were thinking, oh, slaves can buy their freedom, right?
Yeah, what?
Yeah, right. And one of the, was, oh, they can sell the goods they have, that the produce that they've made on their plots for.
I mean, some slaves actually did acquire quite a bit of property, more than you would imagine. But some slaves bought slaves.
Oh, yeah.
And then you work in the fields, I'm going to work in my garden. Yep. And then I think what's important is we think that, the story I told you is capitalism going from one stage to a higher stage to a higher stage of more. In fact, the question is, how do you capture and contain labor?
Yeah.
And it's really clear in the case of Martinique is an interesting case because the slaves elected as their representative to the emancipation coincided with the proclamation of the Second Republic in France.
1848, right?
1848.
Yep.
And the slaves of Martinique elected Victor Schellcher, the chief French abolitionists, as their representative to the French National Assembly.
Huh.
And then he became Minister of Commerce. It's a weird story because there's a revolution in France. They proclaimed the end of slavery. But when the slaves in Martinique heard that there was a republic, they invaded the city and forced local authorities to abolish slavery. And then the ship came from France. Oh, slavery has been abolished. Oh, but we already abolished. So you get this parallel of a popular movement and the political movement in France about the same thing, but they're not the same. And Schellcher, as Minister of Colonies, can't imagine an economic outcome for Martinique other than sugar production. And he's trying to find some equitable kind of sharecropping to make plantation production equally beneficial to workers and owners, and it's an impossible thing.
Yeah.
And it's all swept away by the counter-revolution of and then it gets really more interesting and more complicated. But I stopped there. But you get these so the garden plot is going in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
And it's used it's not a simple thing. It's always a contested terrain in which the enslaved people use it in really interesting ways, but diverse ways. It has diverse. The other book I think is really good is Rolf Triot's first book on Dominica, about that in fact the slaves became peasants and kicked out the British. And the British kept trying to impose a plantation.
French? Dominica was colonial to whom?
Britain.
Britain. Okay.
Okay, and then what Rolf shows is finally bananas became a crop that fit into the peasant agricultural cycle. And the British Fruit Company exploited them through the market, not through production. It's a fascinating book. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I think we ran out a little bit of time, but thank you, Professor Tomich, again for this talk, and you're welcome to stay for the conversation at 2:30 if you like. Thank you very much, and thank you for whoever is at Zoom.
Okay, thank you.